Every winter, roughly 2.5 million American households heat their homes primarily with wood. And the vast majority of them are drying their firewood the slow way. They split it, they stack it in long flat rows against the garage or the fence, they throw a tarp over the top, and then they wait. 6 months, 12 months, sometimes 2 full years for dense hardwood like oak or hickory to season properly. At least, that is what everyone thought was necessary. That the only way to get firewood dry enough to burn cleanly was to be patient and let time do the work. But here is the detail that everyone missed about this process. Settlers on the American frontier and woodcutters across northern Europe figured out centuries ago how to cut that seasoning time nearly in half. The method was simple, required no special tools, and worked so well that entire communities built their winter fuel supply around it. And then, somehow, we forgot. The obsession with faster firewood is not new. It is not a modern hack or a survival trend from social media. It goes back to a time when running out of dry wood in January did not mean an inconvenient trip to the hardware store. It meant you and your family might freeze to death. The relationship between humans and firewood stretches back to the earliest days of civilization. Ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all depended on wood as a primary fuel source for heating, cooking, and industrial purposes. During the Middle Ages, firewood fueled the fires in castles, monasteries, and homes across Europe. Communities organized entire economies around the gathering, selling, and distribution of fuel wood, creating what amounted to a cottage industry that kept villages alive through brutal winters. But for most of that history, people understood something fundamental about wood that many modern firewood users have either never learned or have simply forgotten. A freshly cut log, what anyone who works with wood calls green wood, is basically a sponge. The United States Department of Energy notes that green wood can carry moisture levels above 50% of its total weight. That means when you pick up a fresh-cut log that weighs 20 pounds, roughly 10 pounds of that is water. I mean, think about that for a second. You are not burning wood. You are burning a waterlogged sponge. And all of that moisture has to go somewhere before the fire can do its actual job of producing heat. The energy your fire generates gets wasted boiling off that water, turning it into steam that goes straight up the chimney. According to published data on firewood efficiency, properly seasoned firewood with a moisture content below 20% produces around 30% more usable heat compared to green wood sitting at 50% moisture. Every cord of wet wood you burn is essentially throwing away a third of the heat you paid for in sweat and labor. And it gets worse than just wasted heat. That steam carries dissolved compounds from the wood, and when it hits the cooler walls of your chimney, it condenses into creosote. Creosote is the sticky, tar-like substance that coats the inside of flue pipes and chimneys, and it is one of the leading causes of chimney fires in homes that burn wood. The EPA's Burn Wise program and the National Fire Protection Association both emphasize that firewood below 20% moisture content burns significantly more efficiently and produces far less of this dangerous buildup. So the question has never been whether you should dry your firewood. The question has always been how fast you can get it done. In colonial America, this was not an academic question. It was a matter of survival. The early settlers who carved farmsteads out of dense forest along the eastern seaboard faced a brutal contradiction. They were surrounded by more wood than they could ever use, and they were perpetually short on fuel. The problem was not supply. The problem was that an open colonial fireplace was a spectacularly inefficient way to heat a home. Those massive stone and brick fireplaces that look so charming in historical photographs were essentially furnaces with no damper control, roaring through enormous quantities of firewood while sending most of the generated heat straight up the chimney and out into the winter sky. A typical colonial household might burn anywhere from 10 to 30 cords of firewood in a single winter, depending on the size of the home and the severity of the season. For context, a single cord of firewood is a stack measuring 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. 30 cords of that is a small mountain of timber, and every log in that mountain needed to be felled by hand, hauled to the homestead, split with iron wedges and a sledge, and then seasoned before winter arrived. The families who fell behind on this schedule burned green wood out of desperation, filling their homes with smoke and coating their chimneys with the creosote that would later catch fire. The situation got bad enough that it caught the attention of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, who spent a lot of time working at his desk in Philadelphia, was personally annoyed by the smoke, the inefficiency, and the sheer volume of wood that open fireplaces consumed. During the winter of 1739 to 1740, he observed that despite having active fireplaces burning around the clock, rooms in Philadelphia homes remained uncomfortably cold. He began investigating ways to improve heat reflection and circulation, drawing on earlier European ideas about convection, including a 1713 French treatise on fireplace improvements by Nicholas Gauger. In 1742, he designed what became known as the Franklin stove. It was a cast-iron heating device that sat away from the wall, used a hollow baffle and an inverted siphon to extract more heat from the fire, and radiated warmth in all directions from the center of the room. The cast-iron walls even absorbed and stored heat, continuing to warm the room after the fire died down. The result was significant. The Franklin stove reduced firewood consumption by roughly half compared to a traditional open fireplace, helping to ease pressure on forests in regions like Pennsylvania, where wood shortages had become a real problem. He collaborated with an ironmaster named Robert Grace, who arranged the initial castings at Warwick Furnace in Chester County, and by the 1750s, production had expanded to multiple workshops across the state. But Franklin's stove solved only half the equation. It addressed how efficiently you could burn wood. The other half, how quickly you could dry that wood in the first place, remained a problem that every frontier household had to solve on its own. And this is where the story gets interesting. The settlers who pushed west in the early 1800s, the families who cleared land and built cabins in Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and beyond, faced the firewood problem at an even larger scale. They were felling trees to clear fields, and those felled trees became the raw material for their winter heating. But as one historical account describes the process, cutting and stacking the huge quantities of firewood needed to see a family through the coming winter was a laborious, back-breaking job that had to be undertaken well before the cold arrived so the wood would have time to dry. The next step after cutting was splitting the logs, and this was no small task in an era before mechanical wood splitters existed. The tools were a sledgehammer and iron wedges, wrought by blacksmiths, often hollow so that wooden plugs could be inserted to absorb the shock of repeated hammer blows. The Pennsylvania Germans even developed a specialized tool called a Holzhausen, one of the first multi-tools on the American frontier, designed specifically for the demanding work of splitting firewood. This decision to split wood as quickly as possible after felling it was not just about making the pieces easier to handle. It was the single most important thing a settler could do to speed up the drying process. When you split a round log, you expose dramatically more surface area to the air. A big, intact log traps moisture inside like a sealed container. Split it in half, and you have doubled the amount of wood surface where water can escape. Split it into quarters, and you have doubled it again. The sun and wind can now reach the core of the wood, pulling moisture out of the interior in a way that was physically impossible when the bark was still sealing it in. Every settler knew this instinctively. And the good ones also knew that how you stacked the split wood mattered just as much as the splitting itself. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover forgotten history and lost techniques like this every week, so here is where the slow way and the fast way diverge. And the fast way traces back not just to the American frontier, but to a tradition in Northern Europe that had been quietly perfected over centuries. The most common way people stack firewood today is the same way American settlers defaulted to when they were in a hurry. You build two end pillars by laying pieces in alternating directions, kind of like building with Lincoln logs. And then you fill the space between those pillars with rows of split wood laid parallel to each other. It creates a long, flat wall of timber. It works. The wood dries, eventually. The problem is that this flat row method limits airflow to essentially two directions. Air can move across the face of the stack and maybe through some gaps between pieces, but the ends of the logs, where the most moisture escapes, are often pressed right up against each other. The interior pieces, buried in the middle of a long row, barely get any air circulation at all. A study of moisture meter readings on stacked firewood showed that a 4-inch piece could read 15% moisture on the outer surface, while the center still held 27%. The outside dries while the core stays wet. And because most people check their wood by looking at the ends or doing the knock test, tapping two pieces together to listen for a hollow ring, they can convince themselves the wood is ready when it absolutely is not. And somehow, it gets worse. Now, across the Atlantic, woodcutters in Germany, Scandinavia, and the Alpine regions had developed a completely different approach. The method goes by several names depending on where you encounter it. In German, it is called the Holzhausen, which translates literally to wood house or wood houses. In Scandinavian countries, it is known as Norwegian round stacking. The Shaker and Amish communities in America practice their own circular variation, but the core principle behind all of them was identical. Instead of stacking wood in flat rows, you build a circular structure. You start by marking out a round base on level ground, typically about 10 feet in diameter, and lay the first ring of split wood with one end pointing toward the center and the other pointing outward. You build upward ring by ring, leaning each layer very slightly inward so the structure rises into a dome or beehive shape. The exterior wall is carefully stacked for stability while the hollow interior gets loosely filled with smaller or irregularly shaped pieces. When the stack reaches about 7 feet high, you cap the top with pieces of bark-covered wood laid like shingles, angled to shed rain away from the pile. The result looks almost architectural. Some people describe them as resembling giant beehives. Others compare them to igloos made of firewood. One homesteader in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, described seeing her first Holzhausen by saying simply, "That is beautiful. It caught my eye." But the beauty is not the point. The point is what happens inside that circular structure. The theory, and it is one that practitioners swear by, is that the cylindrical shape creates a chimney effect. Air enters the stack from around the base, where the loosely placed wood leaves natural gaps and openings. As the wood mass in the center absorbs solar heat during the day, that heated air rises upward through the stack just like hot air rises inside a chimney. This draws cooler, drier air in from the outside to replace it, creating a continuous natural circulation that pulls moisture out of the wood far more effectively than a flat stack where the air just sits. And no, I am not making that up. One builder of these structures in Maine, writing for Backwoods Home magazine, reported that his experience backed up the chimney effect theory. He lives in an area with short summers and typically wet, cold conditions in spring, and his wood does not have much opportunity to dry out naturally. The Holzhausen dried it faster than any traditional stacking method he had tried. There is also a practical advantage beyond drying speed. A 10-foot diameter Holzhausen standing 7 feet tall can hold roughly 2 full cords of firewood, approximately 269 cubic feet of stacked wood, in a footprint of only about 100 square feet. A traditional flat stack holding the same volume would spread across a larger area and ideally needs spacing between multiple rows for airflow, eating up even more yard space. One practitioner on a homesteading forum noted that he could fit 4 cords of wood in a 10 by 10 foot area using the circular method, compared to 128 square feet for conventional stacking of the same volume at 4 feet high. This method was brought to America by European settlers, and it has been used in one form or another for centuries. As landowners in Europe cleared their land, the wood was split and left in the fields to dry, using this circular, self-standing structure that required no bracing, no rack, and no lumber to build. It was freestanding and more durable than any flat row stack, making it ideal for the exact conditions frontier settlers faced: lots of wood, not much infrastructure, and a hard deadline before winter. To understand why the chimney effect works so well, it helps to think about what is actually happening inside a traditional flat wood pile on a warm day. The sun heats the outer layers of wood, which causes some moisture to evaporate from the surfaces that are directly exposed. But the heated air just sits there. It rises a few inches above the top of the stack and dissipates. There is no system pulling new dry air into the interior of the pile to replace what already absorbed its share of moisture. The pieces in the middle of a long row might as well be sitting in a closet. In a circular stack, the physics change completely. Because the structure is hollow in the center and open at the base, the sun-heated air in the core of the pile rises naturally, just like it does inside a chimney or a wood stove's flue. As that warm, moisture-laden air rises out through the top, it creates a pressure difference that draws cooler, drier air in through the gaps around the base and the exterior walls. The whole stack becomes a passive drying machine, cycling air through the wood continuously as long as the sun is shining. On a warm, breezy day, that cycle runs all day long without anyone doing a single thing. The mountain men who roamed the Rockies from roughly 1800 to 1860 had their own relationship with firewood, though theirs was more desperate than elegant. These were the fur trappers and explorers who lived in makeshift cabins, caves, and teepees through the worst winters the American wilderness could produce. Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, Jedediah Smith, John Coulter. They survived on dried meat, game, and whatever heat they could coax out of a fire. Winter was a period of near hibernation, with blizzards, starvation, and illness as constant threats. Having enough dry firewood was not a preference. It was the difference between surviving to see the spring trapping season and dying alone in a snow-buried cabin on the side of a mountain. If you're wondering how that is even possible to endure, so is everyone else. These men learned quickly, often from indigenous peoples who had been managing wood and fire in these environments for thousands of years, that the preparation of fuel was as important as the hunting and trapping that defined their livelihood. You did not wait for wood to season on its own schedule. You accelerated the process through splitting, through strategic placement in sun and wind, and through stacking methods that maximized airflow around every piece. The principles were the same ones European woodcutters had been using for generations. Split immediately, elevate off the ground, maximize exposure to moving air, stack in shapes that encourage circulation rather than block it. And then, for about 150 years, most of the Western world collectively forgot this knowledge. The rise of coal in the 19th century, followed by oil and natural gas in the 20th, pushed firewood to the margins. Heating with wood became a hobby, a backup, something people did recreationally in a fireplace on Christmas Eve. The urgency that had driven centuries of firewood innovation evaporated, along with the assumption that your life depended on getting it right. The knowledge might have stayed forgotten if not for a Norwegian journalist named Lars Mytting. In 2011, Mytting published a book in Norway with the title Hell Ved, which translates roughly to solid wood, or, in its more colorful reading, to a Norwegian expression meaning a good, dependable person. The English edition was published as Norwegian Wood, chopping, stacking, and drying wood the Scandinavian way. It was a book about firewood, and it became a phenomenon. Norwegian Wood sold over 200,000 copies in Norway and Sweden alone, a staggering number for a country of 5 million people. It sat on Scandinavian bestseller lists for over a year. Publishers Weekly and the Boston Globe reviewed it. The independent newspaper called it a surprise bestseller with the apparent power to turn even the feeblest reader into an axe-wielding lumberjack. One reviewer on Goodreads called it a cross between the Coen brothers' film Fargo and the cult book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. All for a book about splitting and stacking wood. But Mytting had tapped into something deeper than just the mechanics of firewood. He wrote about the craft, the culture, and the meditative satisfaction of handling wood. He told the story of his neighbor Otter, an older man who spent a month on his woodpile during the warm season and was visibly transformed by the work. Mytting wrote that Otter enjoyed the feel of each log in his hand, the smell that made him feel he was at work inside a poem, the sense of security in his growing stack, and the pleasing thought of the winter ahead. Mytting introduced an international audience to the Holzhausen, the Norwegian round stack, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of Scandinavian woodcutters. His book opened with a poem by Hans Borli. The scent of fresh wood is among the last things you will forget when the veil falls. And he confirmed what practitioners from the American frontier to the German countryside had known for centuries. The round stack, built correctly with good airflow, proper elevation off the ground, and a bark shingle cap on top, dries wood faster, stores it more efficiently, and protects it from the elements better than the flat rows most of us default to without thinking. Norway took firewood so seriously that the country had government ministries and national campaigns dedicated to refining woodcutting and wood-burning practices, even enacting laws to protect consumers and improve heating efficiency. In 2016, Norway became the first country in the world to commit to zero deforestation, a decision rooted in the same cultural relationship with wood and forests that made Mytting's book resonate so deeply. Mytting noted that in Scandinavian culture, arguments about the best make of axe, or whether wood should be stacked bark up or bark down, have been known to erupt at weddings and funerals alike. The bark up versus bark down debate, for the record, is one of those arguments where both sides are partially right. Bark up sheds rain better, preventing water from pooling in the curved surface of the bark. Bark down allows moisture to escape from the inner wood faster because the exposed split face is pointing skyward. The circular stacking method sidesteps the whole argument by placing pieces at a slight inward angle with bark facing outward on the exterior ring, so the bark acts as a natural raincoat for the pile while the interior stays open for evaporation. So what does this actually mean for you if you heat with wood or just want to be better at an old skill? The practical steps are straightforward, and they are the same ones that frontier settlers, European woodcutters, and Norwegian farmers have been following for generations. First, split your wood as soon as possible after felling the tree. Do not let whole logs sit around waiting. Every day a log stays intact is a day moisture stays trapped inside. The quicker you expose that fresh inner surface to the air, the faster the drying clock starts. Second, elevate your wood off the ground. Pallets work. A row of landscape timbers works. Anything that prevents the bottom layer from sitting in soil moisture and wicking water back up into the pieces you just spent all that effort splitting. Third, build your stack for airflow, not just storage. If you are going the traditional row route, leave gaps between pieces, do not pack them tight, and make sure air can reach the ends of the logs where most moisture escapes. If you want to try the circular method, mark out your base, build your exterior ring with the split faces pointing inward, fill the center loosely with your odds and ends, and cap it with bark pieces to shed rain. Fourth, cover the top but leave the sides open. A full tarp wrapped around a woodpile is a moisture trap, not a moisture barrier. You want rain off the top and wind through the sides. The goal is protection from above and exposure from every other direction. Fifth, know your species. Not all wood dries at the same rate. Softwoods, like pine, spruce, and willow, dry considerably faster than dense hardwoods, sometimes in as little as 3 to 6 months under good conditions. But they also burn faster and produce less heat per cord. Dense hardwoods like oak, hickory, ash, and black locust produce far more energy, up to 29 million BTUs per cord for the densest species, but they demand patience because all that density means more water locked deeper inside the wood fibers. And sixth, give it time, but know that the right method buys you months. Air-dried wood in good conditions reaches an equilibrium moisture content around 15%, which is about as dry as it will get without a kiln. Dense hardwoods like oak and hickory need at least 12 months with traditional stacking, and many sources recommend 18 to 24 months to be safe. A well-built circular stack with good sun exposure and airflow, according to practitioners, can get there meaningfully faster because the chimney effect keeps air moving through the pile constantly, not just when the wind happens to blow in the right direction. What the mountain men knew, what the German woodcutters perfected, and what Lars Mytting reminded the world of is not complicated. It is just a different way of thinking about a stack of wood, not as a wall to be built, but as a structure to be designed. One that works with the physics of air and heat instead of just sitting there waiting for time to pass. The techniques that kept frontier families alive through the winters of the 1800s, that heated stone farmhouses across the Alps, and that became a matter of national pride in Norway, were never complicated or expensive. They just required paying attention to something most people assumed did not matter. How you stack your firewood is not a small detail. It is the detail that determines whether your fire actually works. If the history of forgotten survival techniques is the kind of thing that keeps you watching, the video on screen right now goes even deeper. Click it.